Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Facebook live streaming for the week. That's going to be a very exciting week because we're starting to unwind the restrictions around the country, and we're starting to see the flow and effect that means for sport, which is really exciting. That means that sports are now truly looking at how they're going to restart themselves or reboot themselves in the last part of the winter season and in the summer season. And I was really interested to note over the weekend that the SANFL, so the top level AFL state competition in South Australia, is planning to resume without payments to players, coaches, or umpires. So the SANFL is going to resume this year as an amateur league. And look, the SANFL is a very big part of the elite process and the elite pathway. And so we expected that to be a very short-term scenario as football gets back on its feet. But it really brought home to me a question that I've been asking for decades: is why do community sporting competitions, and I mean community sporting competitions, pure community, they're not part of the elite, they're not deemed to be they're not professional, they're not semi-professional, they're community sporting competitions. Why is it intrinsically part of the culture of so many community sporting competitions that we pay our players? To me, it's just ridiculous. Community sport is locals playing locals, watched by locals, coached by locals, supported by locals. It's local community sport. And yet somehow over the journey for a number of different sports and a number of different competitions, that the desire, the need to pay players has crept in and become the core part of our culture. Now, for those, not everyone's going to know my background, but in a years gone by, I was the CEO of the local football netball league here. So it's an area that I've done a lot of work on, a lot of review on, and certainly understand that there's idiosyncrasies everywhere. So, for instance, many country sporting teams wouldn't be able to operate with the number of people in their towns without attracting people from the larger towns and the cities. And how do you do that? Well, there's very little other than player payments initially anyway. So I certainly understand that there's a time and a place, but I want to think about this whole concept of player payments, and I want to really challenge community sport to not come back with player payments in it. Right? Take this opportunity to say, no, we can't afford player payments when we restart, and we probably can't afford them next year or the year after anyway. So give ourselves a window of time to operate without player payments, and let's see what happens to our sport. And I guarantee you there's going to be a couple of things that happen. Players won't drop off, but what will drop off will be the huge workload and the huge stress that player payments put on volunteers. You know, if we think about just my local sporting competition here, there's 10 teams in the AFL comp. Let's just say they've got a $50,000 salary cap. Now, that's unbelievably conservative and probably 50% of it, but let's say it is. Well, those 10 teams, that's $500,000 that volunteers are raising just to pay players that were going to play anyway. Right, in my humble opinion. Because what we were seeing was that teams were giving junior players, they were paying them. You know, as soon as they were coming out of junior competitions and they'd grown up watching the seniors and they loved the jumper, and as soon as they go into a certain level, whether it's reserves, under-19s, seniors, we start paying them. Like, they didn't even ask for it, and neither they we start paying it. We build that expectation that, hey, if you're going to play in this team, in this club, we pay you. And so who pays the cost of that? The people that pay the cost of that is the volunteers, right? Think about how much work across 10 clubs, $500,000 worth of fundraising. It is an extraordinary number of hours. It's an extraordinary amount of work, and it's an extraordinary amount of stress. So I really challenge sports and sporting associations and clubs when they're looking to reboot to really, really look at how we can improve the way that we start sport again. Sport, as we've said, is going to look very different to when it's shut, right? The way we participate, the types of participation, when we participate, the groups that are participating, they're all going to change and change dramatically. Initially because of the social distancing and the crowd restriction rules, but then because of the way the community wants to interact in sport. But we don't need to re-establish the poor things that we had before. And so I rarely get onto the live streams. Actually, I never get onto the live streams and editorialize and kind of rah. But player payments is something that I do feel genuinely passionate about, that for most of the time, talking to a lot of people over decades of thinking about this issue, that it doesn't add in most scenarios, and there are exceptions, and I acknowledge that there are exceptions where we do need to attract people to clubs, and we need to use every tool and resource that we're able to do that in some situations. But by and large, as a general rule, why do we pay players at community sport level? Right? I'd love for you to become part of the conversation. Like there's people online now and no one's put a comment into the chat. I'd love for you to become part of the conversation over the next couple of days, and let's see where this conversation goes. Let's see if there's genuine reasons why player payments should continue. And I'm talking just at that pure community sport level. Locals, playing locals, coached by locals, watched by locals. Right? I'm not talking about pathway and elite sort of sport. So I think now is a tremendous opportunity to get rid of a significant parts of sport that don't add any value, and I think player payments is one of them. I look forward to seeing the comments. I know there'll be people that will significantly disagree, and I welcome that disagreement and that discussion, because anything on this topic, I think, will add value for us moving forward. So to SANFL, fantastic decision to just take the stress off the competition and off the clubs. And it should be noted, there are exceptions for job keeper payments in there, but fantastic decision. And I think community sporting clubs, community sporting competitions can take a really strong lead without being influenced like they normally are by parochial individual clubs that do have the capacity to pay and see a competitive advantage from that player payment process that's in place at the moment. So today, just a short, sharp, I'm not sure whether it's just a thought-provoking, but I needed to get it off my chest. And for those that follow the live streams, give us feedback. Thank you so much. For those people that have become sports community members and allow us to continue to have a platform that we can help volunteers, thank you. An exciting week of guests, more practical, more functional. So tomorrow we've got Wendy from City of Mandurah coming to talk to us about how sporting clubs can link in with council in the reboot stage. And that's really, really important. And then on Wednesday, we've got Chris from a gridiron club, Logan City Lions in Brisbane, coming to talk to us about the donation strategy that they've created through the coronavirus period using the Australian Sports Foundation. So really, really practical on the ground sort of discussions, which is great. And then, of course, eSport Friday, and we'll start to bring in guests from eSport Friday and go from and so really an exciting week of challenge of exciting guests. Also, just reminding you, next week on Sports Community are hosting, on behalf of Vic Health and the Love Me, Love You Foundation, we're hosting some 4 free webinars on mental health for looking at it from the sports club perspective, coaches perspective, committees perspective. So there's 4 free webinars next week hosted by Lance Piccioni from the Love Me, Love You Foundation, which will just be fantastic. We'll put the link to the website registration pages. We'll put that into the notes of this podcast to this live stream. And so it's a great question, how many players, and it's, there is actually a lot of information on that. But again, with netball, I'll just make a comment. In the last decade, netball has been introduced to a number of the football clubs in the competition to which I used to be the CEO of. And originally, the netball club started, or the netball component of these football netball clubs started in the pure community sense, the locals playing against locals. And then slowly but surely, they started paying players, which meant that the volunteers looking after the netballers just doubled and tripled their workload. So, and I watched it unfold over the last decade and watched it really, really closely. So, so it's interesting. Admin North Star Club, a very good conversation to have. It seems to become a vicious cycle. I agree, for clubs who want to remain competitive and chase down the ladder leaders. Well, surely competition should be based on the way we recruit our players from our local community, develop our players from our local community, using and developing our coaches, rather than can we just recruit the best? That's short-termism. And it doesn't actually develop the sport with a long-term perspective. It's a here and now perspective, is my humble opinion. And I love to have other people's opinion. But I'm more about, if we imagine if the volunteers, go back to that example I gave, 10 clubs, $50,000 a club, $500,000 each year. Imagine if they continue to raise that money but didn't have to spend it on player payments. Imagine how good the facilities would be, how much better. Imagine how much better the coaching programs would be. Imagine how much better the experience within our clubs would be. Yeah, and Sue, that's always the age-old argument. It'd be interesting to see if netballers coming back to the netball associations, if they're no longer enticed by the dollar. And I think we're going to get a really good insight with that with the SANFL competition, because the SANFL competition is a step in the elite pathway, but it attracts players from all over Australia to come and play. So we're going to see what happens in that competition. And I have my humble opinion that we play because we love to. We don't play because we get paid. And if we don't get paid, more than likely, for the majority of us, we're going to play somewhere. And that's my humble opinion. But it's a fascinating conversation. It does, and coming from a sports administrator's perspective, so I appreciate that this is like me lighting a fire, throwing it, and then walking away. I appreciate that, because from a sporting administrator's perspective, there's layers and layers of complexity and those sorts of things. But I will draw your attention to one of the largest sports competitions in the country is in Victoria, the Victorian Amateur Football Association, which has got hundreds of clubs in it that are all amateur clubs. Some of the most iconic clubs in our state are full of amateur players, and they have no problems other than the normal of getting players, retaining players, developing players, et cetera, and they don't pay players. They look for other ways to recruit and retain their players in an environment where everybody around them is paying. So I'm really interested to see where this goes over the next couple of years. It's a fantastic discussion, but from a sports administration point of view, it's a fantastic opportunity to potentially take away a really unnecessary part of the culture of many community sporting clubs and organisations. And if we did that, that will make it so much easier for people to volunteer at our community sports clubs. And that's what sports community is about. How do we make it easier to volunteer, make it easier for volunteers? So Until tomorrow, I thank you so much for being part of our sports community.